In our previous video, we looked at how you would create the supply curve that you can see on the screen now, and we considered a market for coffee shops where there were 5 coffee shops, A, B, C, D, and E, and each of them had a different average cost of producing a single cup of coffee. And we saw how as the price in the market increases up this axis, that the higher price will enable more of these firms to become profitable, and they will then enter the market. So as the price increases, the amount of firms in the market also increases, and therefore the quantity of coffee being supplied goes up. And we saw how this creates the upward sloping supply curve that you can see as a result of what we call the profit incentive. Now in this video, we're going to consider how things other than the price may affect the amount of supply. So what could also change, rather than the price, of course, is this, the average cost of production for each firm. And this is going to have a big impact on whether these firms are willing to supply or not. So we're going to consider an example, and we're going to think about what would happen if actually it became more expensive for firms to produce. So we're going to relabel the average cost that we have here as average cost 1, and then we're going to add on average cost 2. And average cost 2 is going to be after there is an increase in the level of cost. So let's say that the costs for coffee shops in general have risen. So all of our 5 firms are going to face an increase in their costs. So let's consider that they are all going to face an increase in costs of 20p. What does that do? Well, it means that, obviously, as you would expect, each of their production costs rises by 20p. So it gives us new average costs, average cost 2. And as you can imagine, this is going to create a new supply curve. So if we call the supply curve that we had previously supply 1, let's work our way through again and consider what happens when the average costs have increased. Well, at 10p, we still don't have anybody producing. At 60p, previously, firm A could produce at 60p and still be profitable, but now after the cost increase, they cannot. So that means that at 60p, we still have output of 0 units. What about if the price is £1.10, as we saw before? Well, previously when it was £1.10, that meant that firms A and B could both produce profitably. Now the costs, though, have risen. Firm B can no longer profitably produce at £1.10 because its costs are now £1.20. So what that means is that only firm A, with costs of 70p, is going to be able to produce at £1.10. So output at £1.10 will be the 10 cups of coffee being sold by firm A. What about then if we go up to the top of our price range here and consider a price of £2.20? Well, which firms will it be able to produce? Firm A will be able to produce there, firm B will be able to produce there, firm C will be able to produce there, firm D may be just on the cusp of producing there. So what happens then is that we get, let's take the 3 that we know will produce, so firms A, B, C and D, so we need another output level here of 30 because 3 firms will result in our point being up there. Now if I join them up with a blue line just so we can see the difference, this is our supply 2. And you can see what basically happened was that at each price level, the amount being supplied has fallen. So what we end up with is movement of these points to the left like that. So we can say that an increase in cost causes supply to shift to the left from supply 1 to supply 2. And obviously, if we'd done it the other way, if we'd reduced the costs to the business, then that would have made them more willing and able to supply. So we would have seen the supply curve shift to the right. Now, one very important point to remember here is when you're thinking about shifts of supply, always try and think about them as shifting left and right. It's a very easy mistake to make that when you think that costs go up, that that's going to mean that supply will fall and therefore the line will move downwards. So don't think about it in those terms. Think about the curve shifting left if it decreases and right if it increases. We made quite a big assumption here though, and we've just talked about costs increasing in a very kind of open sense. So next slide is going to think about a few more specific ways in which the costs of a firm may change and therefore which may cause movements in the supply curve. I find that a little mnemonic is, or acronym is a really good way of remembering the factors which could cause supply to shift. And I think the most comprehensive one and one of the easiest ones that I've come across to remember is insect P. So if you can remember insect P, this will really help you remember the factors that can cause supply to shift. So let's go through what each of these are. So I is for an indirect tax. So this is where a government may impose a tax on the production of this particular product. We will see later on in the course why they might choose to do that, but it basically increases the costs for a firm and therefore will influence supply. The N is number of firms. So we saw this to an extent earlier on where if there are more firms entering the market, then supply will increase. In particular, this means kind of the creation of new firms. The S is essentially the opposite of the indirect tax. So the S is a subsidy. So if the government imposes a subsidy or changes the level of subsidy, that will shift the supply curve to the left or to the right. E stands for environment. And by environment, we may well mean things like weather, for instance, if it's an agricultural product that we're talking about, but also things like a natural disaster and so on. They would impact on supply. So E are environmental factors that affect firms' ability to produce. C is a common one to come up in exams. It's the cost of production. So anything that alters the costs of production for a firm would appear here. So we may well be talking about things like wages would affect this, raw material cost, and so on and so on. So lots of different costs that a business could incur. Changes in any of those would shift supply. T is technology. Obviously, as technology changes, that enables businesses to normally produce more, and that's quite strongly related to the P, which is productivity. Productivity meaning how much can we get from the resources that we have in the business. So if we can get more from our current resources, that will mean that the business will be more inclined to produce, and that will move supply to the right. So some key things to remember then from the conditions of supply. First of all, please think about supply as shifting to the left or to the right. Do not think about it shifting up and down. That will lead to some confusion. So supply shifts left and right. And the 7 things on the screen in front of you there, those are the things which could cause supply to shift either left or right. If they make it easier or cheaper for the firms to produce, that will lead to a shift right of supply. If they make it more expensive or harder for firms to produce, that will lead to a shift left of supply. And a useful acronym to remember those factors is insect